What's up, Bruce? This video is the second video in the series about why you should not invest into sports cards. I decided to record these two videos because of the constant and aggressive promotion of sports cards as an investment instrument which we face all around the social media right now. The link to the first part of this video is in the description. If you are wondering about my background as a collector and as an expert in the investment analysis, just check the first video. And in the first video, we discussed why it doesn't make any sense to invest into active players. And today our goal is to go through and evaluate other forms of sport card investing, that is wax investing, set investing, and vintage investing. Again, all our discussion today will be driven by our key investment principle into risky assets. And this principle is that the only thing we know about risky assets is that over long time horizons, the economy as a whole is growing. But we don't know which individual assets will increase in price. In fact, we know that most individual assets will decrease in price. And the whole aggregate gain is coming from roughly 5% of all available assets. So 95% of assets will actually just decrease in value. If you would like to hear more empirical evidence about why this principle holds remarkably well when investing into sport cards and the stock market and other investments in general, just check the first part of this video where we spend a lot of time on it. Let's start with the wax investing, which essentially means buying sealed boxes of cards. The big advantage of the wax investing over the individual card investing is that there is no player risk. You don't need a particular player to appreciate in terms of value. It's enough if some of the players which can be found from the wax you hold, mostly rookies, will appreciate in value. However, there are still some risks. So in particular, there is a rookie class risk, and there is plenty of rookie classes where there are not many good players at all. And the second important risk is the product risk. You don't know which particular products will increase in price. For instance, Prism, which is probably the hottest product right now, was considered a trash product like for essentially first 5 years of its existence, and was widely available for a fraction of MSRP, while some products which were popular back then, now like people who came into the hobby a couple of years ago haven't ever heard about these products. But overall, the wax investing is a much better choice than an individual player investing, because it allows you to spread the risks across many players. The only thing which is very important to remember, that you should diversify across the years and other products, because as our key investment principle states, you won't be able to tell which rookie year will pan out particularly well, or which product will be particularly successful long term. So don't get into the hype and buy all years and all products. However, the main problem with the WEX investing is that it is financially infeasible for the vast majority of people. Remember that the key investment principle in risk assets tells us that we should buy a portfolio which represents the economy as a whole. Practically, it means that we should buy a lot of assets which represent big chunks of the economy and buy relatively few assets which represent small parts of the economy. In the first part of the video, we have estimated that a very optimistic upper bound for the value of sport cards on trading market is something like 25 billion US dollars. This is roughly speaking 0.05% of the US stock market capitalization. Now, suppose that we as hobby enthusiasts, we think that the card market is really undervalued, and you decided to put 1% of your investments into the sports card market. As somebody who has certain experience advising major asset managers and banks, I can tell you that if you will tell them to overweight something 20 times compared to the market valuations, they will just laugh at you because of how risky it is and how strongly against the aggregate consensus in the market that is. But I suppose that we are really bullish. Just for the comparison, the typical bet the active money managers are taking is this is something they find something which is maybe worth 0.5% of the aggregate stock market, and they overweight it to 0.75%. So that is like 1.5 times overweight compared to the market valuation, and the contrast to our overweight of 20 times is pretty stark here. And as we have discussed in the first part of the video, even such relatively cautious bets fail miserably over time because it's so difficult to pick up the asset to overweight, because only very few assets will increase in value. And yes, what you should understand is that sport cards market is a very small market compared to the size of the aggregate economy, and although it might be surprising to those of you who have just joined the hobby a couple of years ago, this market doesn't always grow. In fact, the structure of this market is such that there are a couple of years of the strong growth, and then most of the time the hobby is actually in the financial ruins, unfortunately. For example, the previous spike in the hobby was the late 80s to early 90s. Before that, there was a spike in the 50s, and in general, if you're interested in the history of the hobby dynamics, there are some good books about it. Like, for instance, I recommend Mint Condition by Dave Jamieson, which will help new collectors to put things into the historical perspective. But back to the WEX investing. Suppose you are really confident that sport cards are undervalued, and you decide to invest 1% of your savings into the WEX. The problem is that you won't be able to diversify it properly. So suppose you're an average broader, and in that case, the median individual income in the US in 2019 is $40,000 per year. If you're earning this median salary, it's recommended that you save and invest $18,500 per year, which essentially corresponds to maxing out your 401k plan. For those of you not in the US, 401k is the retirement system in the US. Now you decide to invest 1% of this 18.5K, that is $185 into the wax. The problem is that you won't be able to diversify at all. For that money, what you can get, well, you can get one hobby box of 2020 score football, or not even end, or you can get, say, one retail mega box of Mosaic basketball. So essentially, you won't be able to benefit from the greatest advantage of the wax investing at all. You will have to make individual bets on a product like Score Football, or a particular retail configuration such as a Mosaic Mega Box. So this is essentially pretty much the same as individual player investing, except that you are betting on a particular product. And betting on a product like Score Football, it's a pure gambling. And as we have discussed extensively in the first video, you should never gamble, because that's a sure way to lose your money. Now, suppose that you actually decide to invest 10% of your savings into sports cards. I tell you directly, like, don't do it, because that's outright crazy to invest 10% of your savings into something which represents 0.05% of the aggregate stock market under a very optimistic scenario. But suppose that you are a crazy person and you decide to do it. So 10% out of 18.5K is $1,800. And will you be able to diversify your wax investment with this amount? No, not at all. Because, okay, for that money you can probably get a box of Prism Hobby Basketball and maybe a hobby box of Prism Collegiate Basketball. That's it. So again, you are not investing properly, taking advantage of the diversification benefits. What you are taking, you are gambling on an individual product like Prism Basketball. And Prism Basketball is a product which came pretty much out of nowhere a couple of years ago, and it can as well go back to nowhere in a couple of years. So again, it's pure gambling. Maybe you think that this doesn't apply if you are a high earner. Okay, let's see. So the individual 1% income in the US in 2019 is 328K annually. Now, while you can earn 40K pretty much anywhere in the US, most of these 328K jobs, they're not exactly in places like Helena, Montana, but in places with high taxes and cost of living. So I'm not earning 320K myself, but I'm reasonably close, and I can tell you that if you live frugally in, say, NYC like I do, you will be able to save something 160K per year on that salary. And okay, suppose you are really optimistic about the sports card market and you decide to invest 1% of this 160K into the wax. So that's essentially $1,600. will you be able to diversify your investments? No, of course not. That's the same situation as before. So you will be able to get a hobby box of Prism basketball and maybe a hobby box of Prism Collegiate basketball. So 2 out of 20 products in just one sport. Again, no diversification at all. The conclusion about the wax investing is, well, theoretically it makes a lot of sense, but practically it is very difficult to implement it without going into gambling. And gambling is something which should be avoided at all costs because that's a sure way to part away with your money. The set investing is exactly the same as the wax investing. Theoretically, it makes a lot of sense because it allows you to diversify player risks, but you still need to diversify across products and across years. As an example, suppose you're a 1% income earner and you also happen to be a crazy person who would like to invest 10% of your savings in the industry, which even under the most optimistic scenarios represents less than 0.05% of the aggregate US stock market. And so your savings are 160K, and it means that you have 16K to invest into the sets. But for that money, you might, in a usual year, you might get something like 2 or 3 top rookie cards from, say, a National Treasures rookie sets in basketball. And that's one set in one product out of 20 in only one sport. So again, this reduces to a pure gambling. Of course, there are cheaper products, but then you are gambling on the sets from these particular products, or if you go to higher end products, then you will have to essentially gamble on individual players. So the conclusion about the set investing is exactly the same as for the wax investing. Theoretically, it makes a lot of sense, but practically it's not feasible for the vast majority of the population. Finally, the last type of investing is the vintage investing. This mainly means investing into cards of players who are already retired, but in a few rare cases, it also applies to players who are still active, but who have already established their legacy. Like, for instance, LeBron James or Tom Brady. Importantly, vintage investing is investing into rookie year cards and a very few other iconic cards. Investing into camo pink parallels of LeBron and Tom Brady, truckloads of which are printed by Panini every year, is not vintage investing. Also, investing in the Wayne Gretzky autos or other Hall of Famer autos, unimaginable quantities of which are printed by card companies every year, is not vintage investing. All these cards will eventually depreciate in value due to the oversupply. The big advantage of the vintage investing is that it automatically gets rid of the player risk. If the player is already retired, it's unlikely that he or she will become a scrap. Importantly, it doesn't mean that the prices can't go down. Of course they can. First, the hobby as a whole might decrease in the popularity. Much bigger industries have gone into complete obscurity in a very short time. Second, in some of these cards, there is a lot of price manipulation going on. For instance, as a recent example, say a Jordan 97-98 Metal Universe card, which is arguably an iconic card. It went from being a $500 card to being a $100 card. Even if you think about Jordan Rockies, every couple of years there are these buyers groups who artificially increase prices, and if you buy during that time, you will take a cold shower, at least for some time. Third, prices of many iconic cards are maintained only by a couple of collectors who are trying to complete and upgrade the corresponding sets. And once they are done, the prices will drop. Yeah, for instance, some PMG sets from the 90s fall into this category. However, in general, the downside in vintage cards is much smaller compared to the cards of active players. And overall, the vintage investing is the only type of card investing I can recommend, because it diversifies the player risk, and it's still affordable. For instance, if you only have $180 to invest, you can buy a vintage card for $180. However, there are some things to keep in mind when investing into vintage cards. So first, given the small size of the trading card industry in general, not more than 1% of your investments should be in trading cards. As I have repeated many times during this video, it's a tiny industry, and much bigger industries have gone essentially extinct in a very short time. Also, you should keep in mind that cards are not very easy to sell fast compared, for example, to stocks. However, it doesn't mean at all that value of your personal collection cannot be higher than 1% of your savings. But as we have discussed in the first video, you should treat your personal collection as a hobby and not an investment. And we are strictly speaking about the investment side of the hobby here. Second, I would strongly encourage you to invest in older pre-war cards. The first reason for that is that there are relatively few of these cards, and this makes them unattractive to price manipulators. The idea of the price manipulation is usually that you buy a lot of cards for cheap, then you manipulate the price to increase it, and then you try to sell your cards at a high price. If something is not available in high quantities, it's difficult to buy a lot of these cards to start with, and then it's also difficult to manipulate the price because sales are relatively rare. The second reason to prefer older pre-war cards is that a lot of demand for cards are coming from people who have seen particular players actually playing, and who for that reason have a certain attraction toward these players and decide to collect their cards. So over time, these people leave the hobby due to various reasons, such as, for instance, death, and this decreases the demand for these cards and might negatively affect their prices. In case of pre-war cards, very few people remember these players actually playing live, so there is no this factor at play here. Third, before investing in the vintage cars, you should actually do the research on particular cars and assets you are planning to buy. Because, like I've mentioned before, the price of some of those iconic sets, they are only high because a couple of collectors are building and upgrading that particular set. So once they are done, the prices will drop. Fourth, and perhaps the most important factor is that there is a steep learning curve before you can actually start investing into vintage cars. And this is because the primary determinant of the vintage card price is its grade. But the grading companies are very far from perfect. The high grade doesn't mean at all that the card hasn't been altered or doctored. In fact, many, if not most, of high grade vintage cars have been doctored to a certain extent, and it's very important to learn how to recognize at least the common types of doctoring before you will do any investing.